We interrupt this podcast, which is devoted to exploring how to educate students, in order to ask, why do we educate students? What's the purpose of education? To talk about what we want to teach or how we want to teach it, we need to ask what underlies this. What are the objectives we have in mind? We ought to be asking that question. That's a question that suggests itself quite naturally. But the fact is that most educators and policymakers don't ask the question. Today, I don't want to argue for one specific purpose of education. I want to make the case instead that it's valuable, even necessary, to grapple with the question and to lay out some of the choices we face in doing so. And I'll begin by drawing an analogy with the field of psychology and psychotherapy. So, an exploration of the purposes of education, the thoughtful, positive goals we might aim for, and the unsatisfactory, tacit goal we're left with when we don't do so. On this episode of Cone Zone, I'm Alfie Cone. So let's talk about psychology. The ultimate goal of therapy is what? Well, to ask that question is to raise the issue of the very nature of psychological health. The problem is that a lot of people, including those in the field of psychology, are allergic to the idea of making value judgments and are really leery about offering specific, definitive prescriptions. Here's what people should do or be like. But the absence of thoughtful, positive goals doesn't leave us with nothing. Something has to fill the vacuum, and we end up filling it with implicit goals. Specifically, I would argue there are two, in the case of psychology, that tend to show up, whether we're aware of it or not. The first is the goal of therapy is to adjust to social norms and expectations. It's about fitting in. An adjustment goal basically assumes that to be healthy is the same thing as to be normal. And so if somebody's maladjusted, the therapist's goal is to help them adjust. The second tacit goal that shows up might be called the medical model. Here the idea is to minimize whatever's unpleasant, just as we're satisfied when a doctor helps us get over an injury, to heal from it, or recover from an illness, get back to baseline where you weren't having any problems. So a psychotherapist might assume that if something has been bothering you, like depression or anxiety or some kind of character disorder, the purpose is to eliminate that, or at least moderate its severity. Now, there are problems with both of those tacit goals. Some years ago, we had psychological theorists who kind of doubled as social critics, like Erich Fromm and R.D. Laing, make the point that a lot about our society is really screwed up, and therefore adjusting to that society might not be an appropriate goal. Abraham Maslow, who described really healthy people as self-actualized, once commented that self-actualized people are not well adjusted. The other problem with a healthy equals normal assumption here is that this kind of adjustment goal is profoundly conservative. If we're helping people to fit in, we are definitely not asking tough questions about the norms and institutions we want them to fit in too. That ends up perpetuating the status quo. Well, there's similar problems with the medical model too. First of all, it sets the bar pretty low to say the goal is not to have the equivalent of an illness. But more than that, fully engaged, really admirable people suffer what could be called symptoms sometimes. If you are a really creative person, you are experiencing some anxiety, I think necessarily. To love is to know sorrow. To make moral commitments is to experience inner conflicts. If you show me somebody who's completely untroubled, that person is probably not an exemplar of health. So there were some psychologists in the middle of the 20th century who realized that the absence of problems or just fitting in wasn't good enough, that we really needed a positive, affirmative definition of mental health. Marie Jahoda, whose name is almost completely forgotten now, wrote a book to that effect. Rollo May, a humanistic and existential therapist, made the same point. If you don't think about it, it doesn't mean psychology is value-free. It just drives the values underground. Well, the same, I believe, is true of education. What happens if you don't ask the question about the purposes of education, engage in dialogue to try to figure out where we want students to end up? What is the objective here? Why would we educate people? If you don't ask those questions in an open-minded and serious and systematic way, you end up by default with something that is, I guess, analogous, I'm arguing, to the absence of illness or mere adjustment. And what that is in education is that it's just a prerequisite for a credential, for snagging credits and ultimately getting a diploma. David Labery, an educational historian, has written about this, and he points out that credentialism is something that we have to thank for the aversion to learning, I'm quoting him now, that to a great extent lies at the heart of our educational system. Labery points out that if the goal is just to get a credential, then it's rational to do as little learning as possible. And he also pointed out that if credentials vary, if they're differentially valuable, then schooling is not going to be a collaborative enterprise. It's going to be the exact opposite of that, where the point is to triumph over everybody else who's trying to earn a credential. So the rational response to an irrational system is, quoting him again now, to try to gain the highest grade with the minimum amount of learning. So our schools become a vast public subsidy for private ambition, an arena for zero-sum competition, filled with self-interested actors seeking opportunities for gaining educational distinctions at the expense of each other. Unquote. That is a deeply disturbing, a desiccated view of education. And I think it's true that when we don't think about affirmative goals of education, that's what you're left with. I just want to get credits. And why would I do any more than necessary? As I've argued in other episodes of this podcast, you don't blame the students who are caught up in that system for lacking a growth mindset or cutting corners or being lazy or something. You look at the systemic causes of this credentialism. And part of it may be related to not only our economic system, to be sure, which plays a major role, but our collective failure to think about a better goal or set of goals. When we set about thinking about this issue and what might be better goals, we come across basic questions, forks in the road. Do we want this or that? And I want to mention half a dozen of those questions. First, is the purpose or are the purposes of education the same for all students? Anyone who's reasonably thoughtful about education, I think, rejects the idea that the type of education we provide is or should be one size fits all. The idea of differentiating instruction clearly makes sense. We want to respond to the needs and interests of each individual student. But does it follow from that the objectives should be the same or also different? And if they should be different, then how? Second question. Should the focus, the goal for education, be mostly practical, which is to say, oriented to occupationally useful skills? One problem with that right off the bat is its connection to the first question. If all education is basically vocational education, then it's going to vary by class, by the occupations that kids are being pointed toward. Incidentally, the emphasis on practical skills and knowledge, especially in higher education, is consistently associated with the political right. And it's sort of fascinating to think about why that might be true. When before he was president, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and he gave a speech in 1967 where he said that education should be about job skills and that taxpayers shouldn't be, quote, subsidizing intellectual curiosity. That was a very meaningful speech. It had a big impact on a lot of educators, and it's pretty much been the same ever since with the Republican Party, right up to the current day, where the leaders of red states and Republican senators and congresspeople are forever inveighing against a liberal arts education, seeing it as a frivolous luxury, and pushing red state universities to get rid of those silly humanities. In fact, it's not just the right, it's the extreme right has the same view. Hitler had no patience for the humanities or for intellectual exploration for its own sake. He was very clear that education in Nazism should be all about practical instruction. Interesting to think about why that exists, why there's a consistent alignment between being on the political right and rejecting intellectual exploration in favor of basic skills and preparing people for careers. Anyway, the second question is, do we want a practical focus to be key when we think about the purpose of education? Third, let's assume we don't. We want to go beyond work preparation. What intellectual outcomes do we want? There are traditionalists who talk a lot about core knowledge, what I call less charitably a bunch o' facts approach, that a body of information should be transmitted to students. And typically the people who want that to be the curriculum tend to prefer a direct instruction pedagogy as the way of directly giving students, pouring into them the knowledge we've decided that they should have. Well, that's very different from wanting kids to think deeply and critically, to be able to play with ideas, maybe even in novel ways. You may want to say, hey, those two aren't mutually exclusive, you can have both, but the fact is that kids are going to spend their days quite differently if the primary goal is that they need to memorize what someone decided all kids of that age should know, as opposed to the primary goal being to help them, and I'm going to quote the early childhood educator Lillian Katz here, help them make fuller, deeper, and more accurate sense of their experiences. That will take us in a very different direction than merely knowing stuff. Judith Shapiro, an anthropologist who later became a university president, put it really well, I think. She said the main reason to get a good education is it makes the inside of your head an interesting place to spend the rest of your life. That's one way of thinking about what our educational goals might look like, as opposed to a more traditional fact and skill-based approach. If we decide that we're not going to stop with mere occupational preparation. Fourth question. Up till now, I've been talking about capabilities. What are kids able to do? Do we want to introduce another idea, which is not just what they're capable of doing, but whether they're inclined to act on those capabilities, to use what they can do? Most theorists focus just on proficiencies as opposed to, I guess we could call it, dispositions. For example, that's true of critical thinking. Almost everybody who talks about critical thinking skills is talking about a discrete list of skills. That does not necessarily mean that people who are taught those skills will be inclined to question and think critically about the things they come up against. That's a topic I've written about at some length. The need to help kids become critical thinkers, not just know how to do that. In fact, it's true of learning more generally. John Dewey, whom I love to quote, said that the goal of education is basically more education, to have the capacity and the desire such that learning never ends. This is very similar to the idea of psychologists talk about intrinsic motivation. I think it's undeniable that intrinsic motivation, genuine enthusiasm, and even excitement about learning is a major means toward the end of learning better. The students who are the most impressive thinkers are typically those who really get a kick out of thinking, playing with numbers and words and ideas. But here the question is intrinsic motivation an end and not just a means? Do we want to build it into our notion of the purpose of education, the inclination to think? Fifth question. Up until now, including that last question, what everything I've said has in common is that it deals with something having to do with the academic, or better yet, intellectual realm. And whenever I find myself weighing one intellectual proficiency or disposition against another, I hear a voice in my head from the late Nell Noddings, an educational philosopher who I admire very much, who said, no, that is absolutely too limited. We should reject, Noddings said, the deadly notion that the school's first priority should be intellectual development. She said, the main aim of education should be to produce competent, caring, loving, and lovable people. Unquote. Does that make sense to you? Many people talk about social and emotional capabilities, talk about the whole child, but when it gets right down to it, people are very nervous about using schools for stuff that has to do with being caring and loving. Do we think Noddings is right? What should be the balance between purposes for schools having to do with the intellectual and having to do with other characteristics of a full human being? Here's where it begins to converge with, to dovetail with the psychological issues of mental health that I had introduced earlier just as an analogy. Sixth and final question. Again, up until now, everything I've said can be grouped together using a different concept, which is all of this has been about the advantages to each individual student. But do we want to think about the purposes of education in terms of their societal impact, the way an education has an effect on everybody? And if so, if we're interested in the social, not just individual benefits, then what are those benefits? For example, is the goal to conserve and reproduce the way things are set up now, our society and institutions? That's what the social scientist Emil Durkheim basically thought of for education. It's about carrying forward social arrangements. Or should we be trying to create people, quoting Jean Piaget now, who are capable of doing new things, not simply of repeating what other generations have done, who are creative, inventive, and discoverers, who have minds which can be critical, can verify rather than accept everything they are offered? So even if we decide that it's about the societal benefit, is it fundamentally a conservative or progressive approach to the way society is affected? And also, regarding societal impact, is it mostly economic? Whenever you hear a politician or a corporate executive speechify about the importance of education and how it should be improved, they almost always, regardless of party, talk about it in almost exclusively economic terms, seeing schooling as an investment, talking about students as tomorrow's workers, about how they need to acquire the skills to help their future employers succeed in a global competitive economy, almost always about competition, about beating other corporations or countries. Well, the alternative to what might be thought of as an economic societal impact is what we could call a humanistic impact. So that's another big contrast to be drawn. And maybe one key aspect of what happens when you look at the intersection of humanistic goal and society as the framework, you get something like democracy, where the point is of schools not only to benefit from a humanistic vantage point, what helps each child grow into the best possible human being, but from the collective perspective, how can schools support and help us to create and sustain a truly democratic society? One framework for achieving those humanistic goals, both at the individual and the societal level, and at the same time for, I guess, refining our thinking about the goals, is a list of 5 habits of mind that my friend and mentor Deborah Meyer came up with. She said there were 5 basic characteristics we want to help promote proficiencies in students, questions to ask, and so on. And the really remarkable thing about these habits of mind, she said, is that they fit with just about any topic in any discipline and at any age. Her 5 habits of mind were these: evidence, how do we know what we know? Point of view, whose perspective does this represent? Connections, how is this related to that? Supposition, how might things have been otherwise? And finally, relevance, who cares? Why is any of this important? And she thought that last one was the most critical of the 5. Also, it connects us directly from the what and how we're educating to the why. Why does it matter? That's a pretty good handle on how to begin to implement some of the more ambitious of these possible purposes for education that I've laid out. I want to end on sort of a meta note here. Maybe the goal here is not merely to help students reach these goals, but the objective is to support students in weighing in on the objectives. Once again, Dewey came up with it first. He emphasized, quote, the importance of the participation of the learner in the formation of the purposes which direct his activities in the learning process, unquote. So, a lot of people who see themselves as more enlightened and progressive will talk about giving students more choices, although, as I've pointed out in another episode, that's often limited to having them select items from a menu they're handed. What do you want to read? Which of these 5 books, for example? Maybe some of them will also say that students should be able to participate in thinking about some components of the curriculum. But Dewey is saying that's not enough. John Nichols wrote a book about a second grade classroom, as well as a number of really interesting books and articles about educational theory. And Nichols pointed out that even young kids are potential curriculum theorists, that's his phrase, who can and should be participating in thinking critically about the purposes that govern their learning. And that's where I'll leave you today. We need to address the why of education, not just the what and the how. And maybe students should be brought in so they can address that question right along with us.